Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Myth, Magic and Movies. Today, we're exploring the characters of the play Mythos by Michelle Medina Villalon, where she explores for characters from American folklore, being Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans, the Lady in Red, a ghostly figure of a woman who died tragically without a name, and the infamous Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee. Over the past few months, we chatted with Michelle and explored how she came across these individuals and told their story through a different lens, giving them each a more rounded persona than what was imposed by convention. So, we've compiled these episodes into one for your viewing pleasure. Sit back and enjoy as we explore the mythos of American folklore.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Myth, Magic and Movies, and Happy New Year to everybody. And today we are going to be discussing a figure that is quite controversial and is also confounding, and that's Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo queen. Now, I've been doing a lot of research and reading about this, but I, for the life of me, can't figure out why she's so fascinating. So to help me out is playwright Michelle Medina Villalon. Villalon. So she's going to help me talk about what she finds fascinating about the character and what we can parse from her life and why she has the reputation that she has. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe. We have a lot of content on the channel. We're still doing our review Oscar contenders for the 2026 Academy Awards. So if you don't want to miss anything, be sure to subscribe. And the robot is always doing his thing on Mondays. So if you enjoy watching the robot go crazy and talking about movies that he doesn't want to talk about, again, hit subscribe so you can stay in the loop. But Michelle, I want to go ahead and dive right in because you were introduced to me by another guest of the show, Jacqueline Obanda Carter, and she recommended that I reach out to you because you have a particular interest in female characters in, I wouldn't say the occult, but in the supernatural lore in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do? Because Jacqueline did mention that you are a playwright.
So my interest in the occult kind of happened a little bit, I would say like in my later teens, just as somebody who had always been afraid of horror movies. I finally started watching them and seeing, the kind of like methodology and the kind of tropes that we see in horror. That became really interesting to me. So whenever it came time for me to write my undergraduate thesis later in college, I was really curious to look at that lens, look at the horror tropes, and like I said, methodologies, myths that we see in horror media, and try to look at it from a theater lens. Because I had to pick an interdisciplinary topic, I also kind of wanted to look at feminism and female representation in horror movies. So I was drawn to looking at urban myths, urban legends. Something that one of my advising professors told me when I was writing that thesis was that you can tell a lot about a culture by what it's afraid of. So whenever you look at urban myths and legends of the United States, you see reflected a lot of the cultural anxieties, social anxieties of the time, and the things that they find scary. So I ended up writing a play that featured four female figures of urban legends. These were the Bell Witch, La Llorona, the Lady in Red, and finally Marie Laveau. And so my background with Marie was a little bit more interesting because she was the one of the characters featured that was an actual real person. We know that she lived, we know when she was born, kind of when she died. And so I think that she is, all of those four figures were interesting, but I was particularly drawn to her because she was a flesh and blood woman who kind of got this iconography surrounding her. So that's at least my background with her.
So I do want to go back to what you're talking about the thesis, because you said originally you had an aversion to horror and you kind of had to find a way to overcome it. When you were writing that thesis, were you able to, I guess, breach the fear that you had, or were you able to sort of, recontextualize, kind of reimagine it through the lens so you could make it palatable? Because horror isn't for everybody, right?
Yeah, for sure. I I think that at that point, when I started writing the thesis, I was already pretty into horror and horror movies, just because I think the stories that we tell and tell again through horror are so interesting, right? Again, it goes back to those, like, you can tell a lot about a society, a culture by what it's afraid of. And you can see through time in our horror movies, the same stories get told over and over again. And once you start seeing that, at least in horror movies for me, it becomes interesting. It's not so much like, oh, look at this jump scare, you get afraid, but it's like, look at how this is just another version of another story we've heard before, and why do we keep going back to these topics? Why do we keep going back to these themes? In writing the thesis, what I thought was really interesting was just to look at it from the female lens. So I studied films like Carrie, Jennifer's Body. There's an Iranian movie that I'm forgetting about right now, but I try to look at different cultures and just see, like, female representation and why certain stories about women that we tell in horror get told again and again. I always give the example of, like, Carrie opens with this, like, very long gratuitous nudity scene, and it's so odd because it's in, like, the middle of a horror movie. So why is it why is our treatment of Carrie, like, something that we find horrific? Like, what is it about that particular character that scares us when she's just a girl? So, anyway, that was kind of, it wasn't so much about making it, I guess, palatable, but I guess it was kind of about diving into it and getting to see beyond, like, oh, this is just something that's scary and, horrifies us and makes us unsettled. And why does it do that? And that was the process that I had tried to at least do with my play as well. That it was based in horror, but I didn't want people just to feel uncomfortable. I wanted them to go like, oh, why does that disturb me?
Right. So you're writing this play as part of your thesis. Can you walk me through the process of how you went about writing this and what it's about and how you kind of approached it from that feminist angle, right? Because horror can be viewed from a lot of different angles. I mean, I know, I know for some people they like to look at it from from just the pure aesthetic angle, like the blood and the gore and everything. Some of them look at the historical angle, some of it see it as a continuation of a tradition that came before, like the Gothic or the medieval ghost stories. So can you talk about, like, what was the process like as you were writing this play, and how did you come to pick these particular characters? Because you did mention Marie Laveau, and we'll dive into her in a little bit, but how is it that you came to select these particular individuals and not others? How come it wasn't like Colonel of the Vampire or Elizabeth Bathory or anyone else like that?
Sure. So, I will say to begin with that, like, the process of writing the thesis was very twofold, right? Because there was, like, a very research heavy component that I wanted to make sure that the characters that I was presenting and the cultures I was representing were told accurately, but also from, like, the theatrical element, I had to pay attention to, like, oh, how have theater companies and producers and playwrights historically treated horror, and so I wanted to kind of meld those two worlds together. Um, the process of writing the play, it started with a lot of heavy research, as I mentioned, really diving into a lot of different characters, not just these four. It was about a process of about 3 months trying to pick out which four women I wanted to feature. And I chose four simply because, like, I couldn't, I wanted to give each character, like, very special attention, and I wanted to make sure that, like, we really dove into them. So I limited myself as far as, the great canon of female urban myths and legends that are out there. But sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Yeah, what I was gonna say is that after the research portion, I started the writing part of it was I started writing poetry, just like I was reading the stories of these women, the things that were believed about them, said about them, and I just kind of started gleaning my own, like, I guess, emotional, mental, psychological interpretations of them. And eventually what it became was I was heavily inspired by For Colored Girls by Ntozake Shange. And she did, like, almost a choreo poem. So I wanted to make sure that my play was very, like, I didn't want to get caught up in dialogue and, partner relationships. I wanted it to be very amorphous is not the right word, but I did want it to be very lyrical and movement based. So I chose poetry as the medium. And eventually, once I had solidified who my four women were going to be, I took the poems and I was like, well, this kind of emotion and idea fits in with Bell Witch, and this emotion and idea fits in with Marie. And I started kind of organizing them until I had that full length one act that we later presented. When it came to choosing the women themselves, the one that I was always certain of that I wanted to feature in this work was La Llorona. Just as a person of Mexican American descent, I thought that she was so interesting because she is a Latin American myth that has been kind of absorbed into the US canon as well because of, the how the Mexican territories were acquired. I want to say that was like the late 19th century, something along those lines.
Yeah, around the
But
1840s, give or
yeah,
take.
yeah, yeah. Yes. So La Llorona was one that I wanted to feature. And then the Bell Witch and the Lady in Red are really interesting. I guess I'll start with the Lady in Red because she kind of is a urban legend that exists throughout the United States. And there's a lot of ladies. There's a white lady, there's a gray lady, there's ladies all over.
Yeah,
And I was
and I was going to say too. I was going to say too because here in North Carolina, like the only story I've heard is the Lady in White up in Asheville, but the Lady in
Mhm,
Red, that I've always seen it more as a European thing. So
mhm.
why this particular figure? Because I do want to do an episode where we dive into that, in depth later on. But what is it about that particular figure that you thought, yes, I think I'm going to focus on her and not the gray lady or the blue lady or the white lady?
Mhm. Well, and I thought that the colors are so interesting, right, that are attached to these women because they convey something about like the way that we perceive them. The lady in red, particularly, I was drawn to because I wanted one of my characters to talk about female sexuality and what it's like to be a woman in love, what passion and intimacy looks like from a female perspective. So,
Mhm.
that's why I was drawn to her. That the others had maybe flashes of that, but that is really what makes up the lady in red, at least the iteration that I found, which is the one that is said to be in the Mitzvah Hotel in Nevada. Um, she is said to be a prostitute who was murdered by a jealous lover. And she also has like a kind of iconography associated with her as well, that she had a necklace of pearls that supposedly fell apart when she was murdered, and she leaves pearls on the nightstands of the people who stay at this hotel. So just the representation, like what this woman represented, like there's so much stigma around women in sex work, and then like I said, female sexuality, that she was particularly why I wanted to focus on
Mhm.
her.
Mhm.
um and then came the Bell Witch. And the Bell Witch, in curating these stories, I wanted to make sure that we had a very wide representation of different regions of the United States. So, La Llorona would be like Southwestern. Our iteration of the Lady in Red was happening kind of in the Midwest-ish, Nevada area. And then Marie Laveau, who I chose prior to choosing the Bell Witch, was in the South, in
Mhm.
New Orleans. Um, I was drawn to the Bell Witch as a person who's grown up in Southern Appalachia. There's so much lore and mythology that exists in Appalachia. It is crazy. Like it is like just that idea of like the woods are out there and who knows what's in them. Like that is so interesting to me as somebody who's grown up here and has heard, things about don't whistle at night. And be careful if you hear somebody calling your name in the woods. So when I heard about the Bell Witch, I was also particularly drawn to her because she seemed to have this very strong thing against men and male patriarchs of families. And I wanted to, because a lot of people, they think feminism, they think men haters. And so
Mhm.
I wanted to kind of look at like, let's look at why this character, at least in my play, might feel the way that she does. And, where does this anger come from? Because it's not just like blind men hating.
Yeah,
Um,
like she focuses primarily on John and not anybody
mhm.
else, right?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
And
and I guess
mhm.
Betsy to a degree, but Betsy, she doesn't get killed, killed off like John does.
Yeah, and it seems almost, when you read the family testimonies about what the haunting was like, she seems to very much hate John, but she seemed to be drawn to Betsy in a way, which I thought was really interesting. In my play, we interpreted that to, she's in love with her. Not historically accurate whatsoever, but we took a little bit of theatrical license with that.
Yeah.
And so it got us to talk a little bit too about queer feminism and women's sexuality in that way. So it got to be representative in that way as well. Finally we land on Marie. And Marie I chose because she does represent, the South as a region. She represents the African American diaspora. And also, I thought she was so interesting because, and we can talk about this later when it comes to the question, like, why was this real person so, in parts demonized, in other ways like hailed and worshipped? Why was she treated this way? It was very rare to see a person like Marie at the time. She was a free Black woman.
Hmm.
And so I just thought that angle was very interesting to talk about. What did it look like for a woman, not a Black woman, not only to be free during that time period, but to also be head of a multiracial religious community the way that she was. So
Yeah.
that was what the selection process and play creation process looked like for me.
Well, that's really, really cool. And I was going to say too, because when the juxtaposition position between the Bell Witch and Marie Laveau, it's basically two visions of the South, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's, Marie Laveau represents, the cosmopolitan South, where it's kind of like this free, I wouldn't say, well, free in quotation marks, but it's this
Mm-hmm.
society that's sophisticated, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
multicultural, as you said. Whereas with the Bell Witch, she's coming from a more, more homogenous society, right? More Anglo-Saxon, Scots, Irish background, where the beliefs and concerns and worries of that society are manifest within that local area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, perfect transition. So I want to go ahead and dive into Marie Laveau, and here are some of the basic facts that we know about her, right? This is like stuff that cannot be disputed because it's on record. We know that she was born in New Orleans in September 10th of 1801, and she died in 1881. Right? She was, like you said, she was a free colored woman. Um, she lived she lived in in a society where she could pretty much move in and out. She wasn't as restricted, which came as a bit of a surprise for me because when you think of New Orleans, at that time period, you're thinking, oh, it's the same as what you would see in Charleston, South Carolina, or Virginia, or North Carolina, right? But that's not exactly the case. We know for the most part that she married a man named Charles Laveau, who passed away, and then she lived with a fellow named Jacques Paris, or Jack Paris, um, and after that she pretty much spent her time as a hairdresser, where she kind of knew the ins and outs of the high society in New Orleans, and she acquired this reputation as being the voodoo queen. And then, like I said, she passed away in 1881, and that's pretty much the basic stuff that we know about her, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I don't understand, and I've been like reading articles and watching videos every which way, and even the videos that I'm watching, they don't really go into too much detail, and they're very, very short. They're only like 10 to 15 minutes long. So you said that Marie Laveau was one of the characters that you chose in your play because out of all the characters who are basically uh, legendary figures, Marie Laveau is a flesh and blood character. What is can you talk about what was about Marie Laveau, that drew you to her? Because she has this reputation for being the voodoo queen of New Orleans, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, she's not someone who, when you read about her life story, really doing anything sensational like the Bell Witch, for instance, or like
Mm-hmm.
Llorona, right? She's, I mean, for the most part, she's doing good work in the community, and everybody loves her, and everybody knows her as as a hairdresser and someone who can get stuff done. So, what is it about this woman that made you think, yes, I do want to explore who she is and write a play about her, and explore who she is as a person, why this legend exists about her?
Yeah, for sure. I think that there are two things that draw me to Marie, and one of them is like if we look at just Marie the person, right? Like I mentioned, free Black woman. She becomes head of this religious community in New Orleans. She's a hairdresser, yes, but people know her as a person who that like they can run to. She's a healer. She's an advisor, a counselor. Like she plays such a huge role in her community. And just looking at that, like I was saying, for my play that was looking at things through a female lens, female ambition during the time period that Marie lived in was highly frowned upon. Like, you didn't really do much other than take care of your home and be a wife and be a mother. As far as Marie the person, that was something that I was really drawn to. Then we get into the whole other thing of Marie the legend, right? That, like you said, this was just a person who lived and breathed and, carried out her life in New Orleans. But then you have the rest of everything that happened after she died, which is, she became this social, cultural icon for this community in New Orleans and for, I would say, like the region as a whole. She's talked about in movies, she's represented in TV shows like American Horror Story. It's said that people still go, actually, I think it had to, like, Marie Laveau's grave had to be closed off because people would go and draw X's on the grave as like a ritual, and it was creating damage to the tombstone. But they would leave offerings too. So what is it about this woman? That's what I was drawn to, at least I was curious to answer, was what is it about this woman that, yes, she was this, extremely important community leader when she lived, but after her death, we really, made her an icon. So that's what I was drawn to. I think that, voodoo as a whole, we have as people who are outsiders to that community, it just seems like either, if you can come at it from one lens and it seems like this very satanic panic, like very scary thing that, oh, we should control, or like, this magic that we can't really understand that is closed off to a certain religious community. So yeah, I wanted to answer some of those questions that, what was it about this woman after she died that made us make her into this icon? And I was also just interested in her as a person, everything that she was able to accomplish.
So how did you go about answering these questions? Because as simple as they are, they're also loaded questions, right? So it's not like sometimes it's not easy to just answer it with like one response. Sometimes it takes a myriad of responses. Like Marie Laveau simply wasn't just this, because as much as we want to look at her as an oddity, right? This free Black woman who was practicing voodoo, we also tend to forget that she was a respected member of the community, and she did go to mass quite a lot too. So she did, so she was, by all accounts, a good Catholic. So it's one of those things that it's a bit curious and a bit contradictory to try to figure someone out, but that's why she's so interesting, because she's a complex person. You can't really peg her down. So can you talk about how you went about trying to answer some of those questions, and kind of maybe talk about like what angle did you go about in portraying her? Did you portray her as like this, as a figure of racial equality, or as like a woman who kind of was a proto-feminist before Gloria Steinem? How did you go about doing all this?
Yeah, so I think that what was really important to highlight in our process is that in the creation of a play, or really any kind of media, when you're focusing on a historical figure as iconic as Marie Laveau, you have to be okay with the fact that you can try, but you're not going to be able to fully represent this woman who she was, like, as a living, breathing person. We focused on some really good things about her, like I said, the fact that she was a leader of this community. We especially looked at the main goal of this play was really to unmask the real women behind these urban myths and legends. So we really focused on her ambition. We focused on what it was like to be a woman that worked as hard as she did, what it was like to carry that kind of burden on her shoulders. We talked about her relationships. For example, Jacques Paris, at some point, she marries him still fairly young, and at some point he disappears from the records. So what was that like to give your life for a person? She also had several children that she lost. What was it like to give your life and body that way? And then, your husband just disappears, or does he die? What happens to him? What is it like to be abandoned in that way? We looked at a lot of things from that lens, again, wanting to really look at it as like she is a flesh and blood human. But, we didn't mention the fact that Marie Laveau actually did own slaves, as a free Black woman. She still kind of succumbed, I guess, to the sociological or socioeconomic pressure of the time that you could control and own other people. So were we able to answer some of those questions? Maybe in our own way, right? We, like I said, we looked at what she represented for her community. We looked at some of our source material, even though it's not the most accurate. In representation was the American Horror Story TV show where Marie Laveau is featured. I believe it's in season 3.
Yeah.
We looked at like the real practice of voodoo and what that looked like, and maybe how that connected to some of that iconography. That again, it's this kind of magic that we don't really understand, and it's deeply, rooted in a certain culture. And whenever we don't understand something, we kind of, whatever, like I was mentioning earlier, right, the things that a culture fears oftentimes are things that they don't understand, and that's why it becomes part of, I guess, the horror canon or the mythological canon of a society. But yeah, I mean, I think that we definitely leaned on some things for theatricality,
Hmm.
and we answered maybe a couple of our questions. But Marie Laveau is just this very, there's so much around her. There's so much myth. There are so many things that we still don't know about her life at this point, and that we probably never will. Um, so we focus on representation, but I will say that we weren't able to get answers to a lot of our questions.
So what did you so what did you learn in the process of researching and writing about Marie Laveau? Like, what were some of the big takeaways that made you think, oh, okay, I totally didn't know that, but I'm glad I know that now.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what I was saying about looking at, the real person who lived and the factual things that we do know about her life, right? We talked in our table work in creating these characters about, what might have it been like for her to be the first woman of generations of her family to be free, right? What does that kind of generational guilt, freedom look like in a woman? I was very, like I mentioned earlier, I was very drawn to the fact that she lost several children. A very common thing at the time, but she had many, and her only 2 surviving daughters were both named Marie.
Hmm.
I think that just says so much about her as a person, that she also, like, she had a couple of her children that were named after her husbands, but to have 2 daughters and the 2 that survive and you give them the same name, like, what does that say about you as a person, right? I was drawn to her relationships. Like I said, Jacques Paris, who disappears and dies, she also later married a man named Christophe de Glapion, and
Hmm.
they were married until his death. So what was it about this third relationship that, was he supportive of her practices? Did he, join her, I guess, as part of, leading this community? What was that difference that made her want to stay? Those were like the real facts that we can nail down about her. That I think communicated so much about who she was as a person. I think that those were my biggest takeaways.
Well, also too, I mean, as much as we talk about these characters, we also got to remember the places in which they exist. And
Mhm.
in this case, it's going to be early 19th century New Orleans. How was it for you anyway when writing this play? How was it for you in framing New Orleans and shaping it in order to tell the story from Marie Laveau? Because New Orleans at that time is very, is a far cry from, Appalachia or, the
Mhm.
Southwest or, or even the Old West for that matter.
Mhm. Yeah. In creating this play, I think I mentioned earlier that one of the words that I chose for inspiration was amorphous. I think it was mostly because I wanted to capture feelings, sensations of these locations without wanting to get lost too much in the facts of it all.
Hmm.
That might sound a little tough, but I'll explain it. That because the goal of the play was to unmask the women that lived in these worlds,
Yeah.
we wanted to kind of keep the focus on them and still, get the feeling of what it was like to be in New Orleans. We could get the sound of the music, right? We got the wardrobe that she would have worn, right? But we also took a little bit of flexibility in leaning into some of this like mythology, right? Whenever we tell myths and oral legends over and over again, we lose sense of what those places actually were, right?
Mhm.
We lose a sense of what it was like to live in those circumstances because, again, it's the myth, it's the legend. We focus on the spectacular, and we leaned into that a little bit instead of shying away from it. Because I mentioned earlier that the goal of this play was also not to just unsettle people, but for them to go, oh, why does this make me feel uneasy? And we thought that we would lose sight of that if we focus too much on like, well, here are the numbers and here are the dates, and here's a very like photorealistic picture of New Orleans at that time.
Yeah.
Um, you know, when you go watch a horror movie, right? Many don't really lean into the history or the, whenever their period pieces. They want to lean in on the thing that makes you feel uneasy. And that was part of what we did. Mhm.
Right. Yeah, and no, I was gonna say because Marie Laveau, is as much part of New Orleans as New Orleans is part of her, right?
Mhm.
So it's really when you talk about Marie Laveau, you can't help but talk about the society in which she lived in, the city in which she lived in, as well
Mhm.
as the religion that she practiced too.
Mhm.
So, Michelle, I do want to be respectful of your time, and I do want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to come on here. Can before we go, can you talk a little bit about your play? Like, is it still um, being performed, or what's the status right now of it?
Yeah, so the first production of the play, I was a student at the time, so it was a piece that was fully produced, fully tacked, designed by students. This was at Catawba College in Salisbury in 2023.
Mhm.
After that, it was accepted into the Southeastern Theater Conference Fringe Festival, so it got to go on tour to Louisville, Kentucky, which was
Ooh.
really wonderful. And then since then, it had been a little dormant until it was submitted to a company called Odyssey Stage. They do a play development pipeline up in Raleigh-Durham area. It was accepted this last year. It recently had a table reading there. I've resubmitted it to hopefully get a stage reading or a performance in the future. But I'm also excited to say that there's a couple of production opportunities on the horizon, particularly one here in Charlotte that I'm looking at. That stuff is still a little bit to be determined. Hopefully, it would be in spring of 2026.
Mhm.
But I am really excited. Whenever we did the table reading at Odyssey Stage earlier this year, I finally got to hear this piece performed by people who were of the age of the characters, which was really nice.
Yeah.
Llorona being told by like somebody who could have children. Marie Laveau being told as somebody who has or who could have lived, this life as a community leader. So I'm really hoping that we can get more production opportunities on the horizon.
Now, how involved are you? Or like, are you like hands on, or are they asking you or consulting you for a lot of things, or are you just there because you want to be there?
I'm there right now, or at least I attended the table reading to see if there were edits that could be made to the script. The script has been significantly edited since the performances in Salisbury and Kentucky.
Okay.
I think right now it is pretty much in its final stage. There may be like a couple of small section revisions that it's waiting on, but really it feels like a complete work at this point. I honestly offer theater companies as much hands-on or as much hands-off as they want. I think that I got to do the thing that every playwright wants to do, which is like put out the work as they see it in their heads. Whenever I got to produce it at Catawba College, whenever I got to take it on tour, everything that I had wanted, that I had envisioned for the show, I put out there. And so now really I just want to hand it over to a director, and I want to see like what can you do with this?
Hmm.
And how different does it look like from my vision and the thing that I created with it?
Do you have any plans for writing any more plays, or is that to be decided based on
Yeah.
based on this?
Something that I loved about this play is called Mythos. It's crazy that I've gone this entire time and have not said the name. um, but so something about Mythos that I enjoyed was that I really, as a playwright, as a first time playwright, I think I struggled with creating, the traditional like two act intermission, dialogue heavy script. And the thing that I loved about Mythos was that it was poetic and lyrical, and it was movement based, and it is as flexible as the director could want it to be.
Mm.
Um, I recently finished writing the first and a half maybe draft of another script that is a lot more traditional. It's called The Lovers. It looks at a two-person relationship, two characters in their late 20s that have been together since college. And so that's very different than Mythos. But I am hoping to maybe write another play like Mythos that is poetic, that is lyrical, just because, and I give this advice to playwrights and other theater artists all the time, that if the format and method that you're working with feels difficult and you can't create in it, just break the rules. Like, nobody's telling you that you can't write 40 poems and create them into a play. Like, honestly, maybe we could use some more of that. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping for another opportunity to do that in the future.
Well, Michelle, I definitely do plan on having you back on for future episodes. I would love to do an episode where we talk about your playwriting process, because that in itself is something I'm interested in. But I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch us. If you're enjoying the content, remember to hit the like button and subscribe, because we do have a lot of episodes in the pipeline for not only Myth, Magic, and Movies, but Thespians and the Movie Pope. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Myth, Magic, and Movies, the show where we look at all things supernatural, fantastical, horror, and true crime related. But it's a new year. We've got new shows on the way, new episodes. Definitely going to do more of the Star Wars and the Gothic, as well as looking into the series The Boys from a horror perspective. So if that's something you definitely want to be on the end, just hit the subscribe button and notify, so you're always in the loop. And we have other shows on the channel as well. We've got The Robot on Mondays. Lee and I do trailer reactions on Wednesdays. And on Fridays, if you want to hear a man sit and drone on and on about a movie for an hour and 30 minutes, Lee's your guy. But today we've got a familiar face back on the show, and we're going to talk about a character that I sort of know about, but at the same time, I don't know too much about. And we're going to be discussing The Lady in Red. And, to guide us through this conversation, we have Michelle Medina Villalon here. And we had her on last month where we talked about Marie Laveau. That episode will be out at the end of January, as typical with most Myth, Magic, and Movies episodes. So again, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, so you get notified of when that episode drops. But without further ado, Michelle, how are you doing on this, well, I wouldn't say fine, but sort of gloomy Saturday afternoon?
I'm doing good. I think, yes, it's also gloomy here, but it's pretty good weather to talk about ghost stories.
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to say, too, because I was doing a little bit of digging about The Lady in Red. And what's fascinating about this character, and I mentioned this before we recorded, is the fact that this is a ghost or a ghostly or supernatural figure who's very localized, right? There isn't a universal, origin story that we can go back to, right? So like La Llorona, for instance, if you ask someone in Seattle, for example, they'll be able to tell you, they'll be able to give you the basic gist of who she is, just as if you went to Austin, Texas, right? Or if you went to Boston, Massachusetts, there is a universal consensus as to who she is. Same with Marie Laveau, who we discussed last month when we were talking about her impact in New Orleans, but also how and why she kind of has the reputation that she has as a sort of as the voodoo queen of New Orleans, right? So even though Marie Laveau is more tied specifically to a city, whereas La Llorona is more tied to a people, there's still a general understanding and knowledge of who she is, right? Whereas when we talk about the lady in whatever color she's in, it really comes down to where you live in the country, because unlike La Llorona, there is a huge Latino diaspora, in North America, the U.S. and Canada, where there is a shared memory and understanding of who she is. Or Marie Laveau, who has become popularized in mass media over the past 20 years, big one being American Horror Story, right? Mm-hmm. The Lady in Red, depending on where you are in the country, she has a different origin story and a different impact and influence on that community. So, Michelle, you brought up I won't I won't recap everything that we discussed last time because you got to check out the episode to see that. But you did write a play called Mythos that looked at 4 female figures who are prominent in the supernatural and folklore sphere. And we already mentioned Marie Laveau and La Llorona, but the other one that comes to mind is the Lady in Red. Now, here in North Carolina, I'm only familiar with 2 ladies, but they're the ladies in white, I believe. One of them is out on the coast in the Outer Banks. I think she is either Aaron Burr's daughter or someone who's related to to the vice president. And then you have I think it was like the blue lady or the lady in white in Asheville who haunts the hotel over there. I want to ask you, who exactly is the lady in red, and what is it about this particular iteration that kind of drew you to her, that made you say, I think I am going to, write a few scenes about her and kind of put the limelight on her, because because there's something about her that speaks to me that, that, I don't know, the lady in blue or the lady in brown or the lady in black doesn't, for you.
Yeah, so talking about just the ladies in general of, I guess we can stick to the US, but at least the Lady in Red exists in Canada, Northern Europe, in parts of Asia as well. But typically in the US, we have, like you said, lots of ladies localized to certain cities, or smaller towns, regions. And a lot of the times the color that is associated with them has something to tell about their story, right? So ladies in white are typically, they're depicted as virginal or very young, ingenue types. Ladies in blue, there was something sad, major that happened in their story. And then the lady in red is typically associated, with a crime of passion, and then she's usually seen as a sex worker or somebody who, like, her tumultuous love life led to her end. So the reason that I was particularly drawn to the Lady in Red, I think I talked about last time, the process of selecting these characters was very deeply tied to female archetypes in movies. And the archetypes that I had chosen to focus on were the final girl, the female victim, the monstrous mother, and then what was the other one? Sorry. Oh, and the femme fatale. And so I had managed to kind of, slot the other myths that I had chosen into those roles, but I was still looking for a female victim. And so I thought that I was drawn to the story of the Lady in Red. Just like, for transparency, I discovered her through, and I'll give her a little shout out right now. There's an artist on TikTok and YouTube. Her name is J Lauser, Lauser art. And she does like an Inktober, like scary stories from different regions of the US, from different parts of the world. She had drawn a picture and told the story of the Lady in Red, just kind of generally. The one interesting thing about the Lady in Red is, yes, she is very localized. Like, every region and city has their own particular story about her. Sometimes they give her a name. Sometimes, she's killed in different ways. Sometimes she kills herself. But the overarching similarity between all of them is that, like I said, she's typically a sex worker. She's usually murdered one of 3 ways. Either she takes her own life, she's killed by a jealous lover, or she's killed by the wife of her lover. And all of them seem like she seems to always be a very friendly spirit. In the particular version that we chose, she leaves pearls from her pearl necklace on the nightstands of guests at the hotel. So because I was like I said, looking for a female victim in horror is typically, typically promiscuous, usually the first person to die in the horror movie. I said, look at what a natural fit that, like, if you look at it from a very stereotypical lens, right? Again, a story of a promiscuous woman who was killed. This might be a good slot for her to fill. And another reason that I was drawn to Lady in Red, I think like I mentioned, it's so interesting that we summarize these women into these colors based off what their stories were like. And the interesting thing is that you look at other ladies, like the white lady or the gray lady, and a lot of times we know their names and we know that they were real people. Not to say that some people don't give the Lady in Red names, they do, but a lot of the time she is this figure of mystery. And I personally think that that's very deeply tied to the fact that she was a sex worker, right? That, you know, these are kind of women who appear and you don't know their names, you don't know their real names. They give a certain name to their clients. They live in anonymity because their work is so stigmatized and so scandalous and hush hush. So I was really, you know, as a playwright whose intention was with this work to kind of unmask the women who are behind these myths, I said, oh, look at this woman. Why don't we give her a name? Why don't we give her a story? Why don't we acknowledge her and remove kind of the anonymity? So I ended up focusing on her. Oh, I think that you're muted. I wasn't able to hear you.
Oh, sorry. So to pull on that thread that you mentioned earlier, what if I mean, because of, you know, because someone who is wearing white or blue, that, you know, we associate with a certain type of attribute like virginity or purity. Red, there's a bit of more of a visceral quality to it, right? So, you know, so usually when we think of the lady in red, like you said, you know, sometimes it's sex work, sometimes it's something that's a bit more horrific, right? What I've also noticed too, and I don't know if this is something that you ever came across when you're doing your research, but when you look at figures who, you know, like the lady in red, who have committed a terrible crime, like they killed someone out of passion, there's usually this antipathy or this animosity that the spirit kind of holds against either like certain types of individuals or a gender, right? So, so sometimes like you'll watch these ghost hunting shows where they say, you know, this particular lady, she murdered her lover and then she died in this room, and people who come and stay at this hotel, this place that got converted into a hotel, she's very friendly towards women, but if a man stays there, well, let's just say you're in for a rough night, and not in a good sense, right? Is that something that you've typically seen, or that you've kind of found interesting, that that they sort of carry, their passion or their animosity or that anger that kind of motivated their crime into the afterlife and into this sort of purgatorial existence of haunting?
Yeah, definitely. There's always, I think it's interesting with all the ladies that the stories that people tell them about them, whether it be on ghost tours, people who come and visit the hotel, it's always like they expect some kind of interaction with her, right? And I think particularly with the lady in red, that's what's advertised for her, that she's going to interact with you, and that's the expectation of guests who stay, for example, in the rooms that belong to her in the hotel. The particular legend of the lady in red that we focused on in our show was the one in the Mitzvah Hotel in Tonopah, Nevada.
Yeah.
And she is always said, like I mentioned, to be very friendly to both male and female guests, which I think is interesting. That part of also, whenever I was writing the play, that I was drawn to this particular iteration of her is we wanted to explore kind of love through the lens of non-monogamy, right? And how like unusual that was for that time period. So I think it's very interesting that even though the story that's associated with this lady in red is that she was murdered, you would think, especially by a jealous lover, that she would be hostile towards men, but she's still friendly. So from a fictional storytelling standpoint, why might that be, and why do we still kind of hear those stories about her positive interactions with male and female guests despite her history?
And that's interesting too, because it would be very easy in a way to kind of focus on a female apparition that is still vengeful, right? La Llorona is a pretty good example, because she has this this unfortunate reputation of going after people's kids if they wander too far into the river, and she grabs and drowns them, right? Mm-hmm. So it would be very easy to kind of focus on a character who is still very embittered about the way she died, or the way that she felt about a certain person that led to her death, and that she kind of holds all men. She kind of brushes men in a broad brush, and just says, all you men, throughout history, no matter who you are, you guys are jerks. I'm just going to come after you. Mm-hmm. Did you find it very tempting to kind of lean towards that, or was that something that never crossed your mind as you were considering the Lady in Red in
Yeah.
your play?
Yeah. So not necessarily with the Lady in Red, just because my other myths kind of did that for me.
Okay.
I talked about in the last episode that we did about how you can tell a lot about a society by what they're scared about. And I think one of the things that I found interesting about the Lady in Red was, like I mentioned earlier, that she's not, in this particular iteration, she is not a hostile spirit. My other characters, the Bell Witch, Mary Laveau, La Llorona, we're doing that. But I think it goes back to like what I was saying about, us being scared of a society. Sex work is one of the things that American society, because of our puritanical history, is something that we're scared about. And I
Right.
think something that I see reflected in this telling of the Lady in Red is that, like, guests come to this hotel to see her and to experience her. And I think that that says a lot about like what we think about sex work. That is something that we push to the side, that's very hidden, it's very secretive, but there's still some kind of taboo, like guilty pleasure quality to it that we want to experience. We want to be a part of that.
Well, plus, I mean, well, plus too, it's also in Nevada too, and Nevada
Mhm.
is kind of infamous for being a bit fast and loose with the
Mhm.
morals. I mean, big one that comes to mind is the Bunny Ranch.
Mhm.
That that people kind of frequent. They know they shouldn't go there, but they kind of frequent it because it's too much of a temptation to pass.
Yeah. And one of the things, I can't speak on this because I didn't do as much research on the Lady in Red in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, like you said, it's interesting that you bring up, Nevada, that, yeah, it is a town. We also associate it with Las Vegas is the first thing that comes to mind, right?
Mhm.
And so I wonder in other regions where you hear the story of the Lady in Red, maybe there is some of that hostility because that's the general region's attitude towards her line of work, right? And in a region where maybe we were a little bit more comfortable with that, maybe that's why we describe her as friendly. Maybe that's why we see her as someone to maybe want to have an interaction with rather than somebody horrifying. And maybe that's also why the legend that's tied to her is that she was murdered and not that she murdered someone. Therefore, like not making her a vengeful kind of spirit.
Right. I mean, not like Elizabeth Bathory, for instance, the infamous blood countess who was famous for taking all these young maidens and killing them and bathing in her blood in an attempt to you know rejuvenate herself.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um. So so what really fascinates me about this is because, as you said before, the other four characters, or the other three characters, I should say, in your play, they have names. Like, we know who they are, and there is there is documentation about who these people are, where they come from, and what happens to them at the end, right? Even the Bell Witch, to an extent, we've ascribed the name to her, Kate Batts, even though the real Kate Batts, was still around at the time of the haunting of the Bell family. But but what's interesting is the fact that with the Lady in Red, this is an anonymous person who, as you said, has kind of been condemned. It's sort of like this damnation of memory, right? We don't really want to know who she is. She's a thing. She's
Mhm.
invisible. We don't see her, and and you mentioned that in your play Mythos, you want to give her a name and a backstory, so she kind of she isn't forgotten, right? So she isn't sort of relegated to the sort of guilty pleasure, or the sort of, I would even say, some sort of spiritual fetish,
Mhm.
where she's kind of this object of fascination, like like anything else, like a sex worker,
Mhm.
that we see in either Amsterdam or Las Vegas or anywhere else around the world. So can you talk to me the process of how you went about of looking at this individual and deciding, how do I give her a name? What name do I give her? And how can I properly tell the story that honors the legend of who she is, but also kind of humanizes her as well? Well, I wouldn't say humanize her, but kind of returns her humanity to her.
Yeah. One of the things, as somebody who kind of grew up immersed in horror and true crime, one of the stories, especially in true crime, that you hear told over and over is serial killers will begin their work by murdering prostitutes, sex workers.
Hmm.
And the reason that they do that is because they say, well, nobody cares about these women. Nobody's paying attention to them. Nobody knows their names. And so that was like I mentioned, that anonymity of the Lady in Red was something that really made me empathize with her as a writer. That, you know, I think largely the reason that she's nameless, and that her story changes, that's actually a line from the play, that her story changes with every form and iteration, is that there is, like you mentioned, some sort of fetishization, of that anonymity, right? That she was a woman without a name, a woman without a story. So when it came to giving her one, I was deeply inspired by the events that we see in real life about women who are sex workers who are murdered. Um, and so I wanted to preserve a portion of the anonymity, so we kept her name the Lady in Red. Some regions, you know, will say that her name is Rose or Evelyn, and I said, you know, let's preserve that anonymity, because I think that she kind of tells this overarching story, or this maybe uh, how can I say, like, this one story of women in sex work, and women who are ignored because of, you know, whatever stigma surrounds their profession.
Mhm.
But in the process of giving her a story, I mentioned earlier, like, the idea of non-monogamous love and things like that. This is just something more of something that I put in there, as a writer who is, you know, working towards with an agenda. I think that a lot of times in history, in U.S. history particularly, women in love is always tied to marriage, is always tied to reproductive status, right? Motherhood. And I was really interested in looking at a woman who, like, as a sex worker, didn't just do it because it was her job, but she loved her clients, and was looking for love in maybe the wrong places, without putting that judgment on her, right? So that's kind of where we started that exploration, was, you know, what does love look like for a woman who loves lots of clients a day, right? How do you preserve your soul in that situation? That goes back to the fact that this story of the Lady in Red in the Mitzvah Hotel, she's not hostile, right? So clearly, in the world of our story, she loved her clients. She didn't feel used or taken advantage of. Um, and so then I was wondering, you know, how does that, the story in the Mitzvah Hotel is that she's killed by a jealous lover. So how does this, you know, antagonist come into her life? And we said, well, maybe, you know, as she gets older, she starts losing clients. She doesn't look as, you know, conventionally beautiful anymore. Or maybe, you know, she was, even though she might have loved her clients, they were just passing, like ships passing in the night, and they would go back to their wives, they would go back to their families. So that's kind of where we started building that story. And we worked very closely with the actress who was playing that role. Her name is Aslan Goodwin. She brought a lot of, you know, I think, vulnerability and softness to the role. We were really looking to find, you know, the female victim that this archetype, that the Lady in Red, you know, was based in that archetype for our story. She's often just, you know, just portrayed as promiscuous and stupid. And we really wanted to see, you know, how does this character look like as an intelligent, vulnerable human being, who maybe just, I mean, maybe she enjoyed the work that she did. Maybe she ended up there on accident. You know, we hear so many stories about young women ending up in sex work because they're poor. And so, like I said, we really just, and you mentioned, like, returning her humanity back to her. What are the circumstances that may have brought her to this situation? Why did she stay? You know, was it for money? Was it because of love? This jealous lover that came into her life, what role did he play? And we, in our story, decided that maybe, you know, as she started losing her clients, he was the only one who stayed. And, you know, we kind of wanted to explore also, like, you know, that world of domestic violence and possession that can come into relationships too.
Mhm.
So I think hers, you know, we took a lot of creative liberty with all the stories. With hers, you know, we basically created a backstory out of dust. But I think that it was really based in our collective experiences as women and in love, but also, like, kind of paying homage to, I guess, the stigma that surrounds sex work and the kind of curse of anonymity that comes with it as well.
So, so you mentioned you mentioned this earlier as well, and I want to kind of circle back to it, because you said that as you were writing this play, you were taking the four female archetypes in the horror genre and finding a figure that kind of fits into that slot, right? So. So obviously the Lady in Red would fall into the female victim type of thing, and more specifically, the first girl who gets killed, and there's like this there's like this joke that people always make, is that usually the first chick who gets killed, she's, you know, quote unquote the slut. She's the one who who decides, to get a little bit loosey goosey, and then she doesn't, when she lets her guard down, that's when the slasher or the killer or the monster comes out of nowhere and ends her. Right? Did you? How much of that kind of went into your thinking as you were writing, the character of the Lady in Red in your play, or were you just thinking to yourself, I want to take that joke that a lot of people make about the first female victim in horror movies and kind of flip it on its head, and a bit?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that kind of subversion was the reason that I picked that character. Was one of the reasons that I picked the Lady in Red.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say something earlier to your point. But yeah, I mean, that subversion was very important in choosing that character. I also think that a lot of times whenever we see this first character get killed, it shoots off another it often kicks off the action. It's the beginning of the plot. So that's why in our story, in our play, the first story that we tell is the story of the Lady in Red, because it kind of starts a chain reaction, gets the other women to want to tell their story as well. I was limited in writing this show that in horror movies, you have an antagonist and you have a real threat to run away from. And in our story, it's a lot more about just kind of the women telling their own stories. So we weren't able to, or we didn't touch on the fact so much with the female victim, the first woman to get killed. That, I guess, that plot line and that tension that is to be expected. It really was about flipping the archetype and, seeing, okay, so she gets killed, she's a slut, but who is this story? Who is this character?
Yeah, and that's another thing too, because because as we're talking about these characters, they all sort of all sort of represent the subversion of what what the male expectation is. Because when you hear someone like the Lady in Red, you're just thinking, oh well, she kind of she was a sex worker and it's unfortunate, but that's what happens. Or someone like the Bell Witch, you just think to yourself, well, geez, she's a really, really nasty piece of work. It's a shame nobody tried to get rid of her. But at the same time, it's well, why is it that that men feel that way? And you kind of hit the nail on the head, where depending on where these stories originate from, it kind of speaks to what kind of fears or concerns that particular part of the country would have, right? So and we're going to do an episode on the Bell Witch, so I don't want to delve too much into it, but in the South, for instance, very patriarchal, very hierarchical. You've got the man at the landowner at the very top. He's the one who calls the shots, and everybody else, from the children down to the servants down to the slaves, they kind of know their place. Whereas in Nevada, it's a bit more free, because it's especially around the late 19th century, early 20th century, it's still trying to figure out what it's trying to do. It's trying to sort out its identity, right? So yeah, and you also mentioned in the last episode too that when you were writing this play, you were kind of cherry picking from different regions of the country. Were there any particular sensibilities or sentiments about the West or Nevada in particular that kind of made you think, I'm gonna lean on these values or these ideas here to kind of flesh out my character, or flesh out or kind of guide the way I'm writing this character in this play?
Yeah, one of the reasonings, I guess, also behind picking the Lady in Red is that I was trying to choose characters from different regions of the U.S. to, again, kind of reflect some of our fears back to us in the show. And so the Bell Witch, was Southern Appalachia. La Llorona was Southwest, in the occupied parts of Mexico. Marie Laveau, I didn't get anybody from the North, but I thought that Marie Laveau was a part of the South that is very, particular. New Orleans feels different because, of its backgrounds with the French and the Cajun people and the enslaved people that were in that region. So I think having a story from Nevada, particularly, the Lady in Red didn't originate during the time of the Wild Wild West, but it reflects a lot of the fear, I think, that the country had about that region for a very long time, that what's going out there and what's happening in this kind of feeling that, from maybe the north and northeast of the country, that that is an area without law, right? And that of course the lady in red could come out of that because, you know, her line of work was stigmatized and illegal at the time. So I think that it is kind of innate that a ghost story happened about this particular character because it reflects you know, the country's feelings about the West at the time, right? That
Yeah.
it's, like I said, a place without law, a place with disorder, and, you know, a place where young women can, you know, maybe leave their homes and their righteous upbringings and go and be loose and wild. So that's what drew me to that region, you know, and also just as like a history buff, like I thought it was so cool, you know, the town of Tonopah is where a big silver rush happened, you know, the
Mm-hmm.
Mitzvah Hotel came up out of like this idea that there was a lot of prosperity in that town. And so I think it's very interesting that like, oh, we judge that place because it's the Wild West and it's a place of lawlessness, but also it's like a playground for the rich to go and do whatever they want. And so, yeah, I think it says a lot about us as a country at the time that this story was kind of born out of that region.
Yeah, because the story, because the way I understand the story is it's coming to us, right around like the end of the Civil War, right? So we're talking about a country that's been, that's spent 4 years tearing itself apart, and now people are pretty much going west to try to escape what's going on, try to like rebuild their lives. But and to your point, this is a period where people are are striking it rich. They're making huge names for themselves. So so it's definitely an opportunity, but it's also a very dangerous situation because you've got the Indian Wars going on as well. So it's sort of a mixed bag where if you're willing to risk it, you can make a lot of money, but just be prepared to you might get scalped if you're not too careful. Not to mention, and you probably know this as well, a lot of former Civil War soldiers, after they begin drifting around after 1865, and some of them turned to a life of crime. Big name is Jesse James, for instance, the Hole in the Wall gang. They decided, we're just going to go around and start rustling cattle and robbing transports. So the world in which the Lady in Red exists, it's already a dangerous world as it is, and then you add on the fact that she's an unmarried woman, right? Who's doing a trade is very much frowned upon, but at the same time is kind of necessary because you do have a lot of dudes out there, and you create a situation where it's. I mean, I would even say it's almost like a no-win situation, right? Because it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing. Well, because if you stay where you are, you're pretty much not going to get anywhere in life because the part of the country that you're living in has been wrecked for 4 years. But if you go out west, there's a slight chance you may improve your odds. But as a female, I don't think your prospects will look any better unless you like married into wealth. And not to mention too, you have the Indians out there who are pretty much hell bent on fighting back and will go after anybody to try to send a message to the U.S. government. Hey, we're not going to roll over. What are you going to do about it, right? Sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I was gonna say that again to your point, like in particular the story of the Lady in Red, like there's already kind of this sort of intrigue that happens in that region, right? And there's I would say this also in rehearsals, that a sort of sauciness to her story. That I think as Americans we've always been drawn to a tall tale, and we can say that maybe we are upstanding in our like puritanical and like biblical religious righteousness, but there's always something that draws us to the dangerous stories, and we want to be observers. We don't want to be participants. I think that's something that's a notable quality in the story of the Lady in Red as well, that the reason that oral tradition of her, or that oral tradition in the West produced something like her story, and that story continues to be told, is because we as a society want to look at those kinds of stories and be like, ooh, and then what happened? And there's like almost a gossipy quality to it. Because we like to speculate even about the things that we say are dangerous, and things that like maybe we would never go out west, and we would never participate in sex work, or we would never go to a region where there's so much crime. but we still like to speculate. And so I just want to say that, yeah, I think that that's part of the reason why this story has lived on for so long and even has sprouted up in different places. The story of the lady in red, that like we like, even though we say that we are righteous, or maybe we're upstanding members of society, we love a good gossip story, and I think at its core this is kind of what that is.
Well, let me ask you this too, because when it comes to telling these stories, you're obviously trying to represent these figures as not just ghostly figures that everybody kind of gawks at and kind of oohs and ahs like an exhibition at the circus, right? You definitely want to give them a face, you want to give them a name, you want to give them a story, so so people remember that these are individuals with their own agency. Did you, at least with the lady in red, did you feel that there was a need for a moralistic angle to where you present the story and you kind of say, well, this is who the lady in red was, this is what happened to her, there, now I give a call to action that maybe, I don't know, maybe we should kind of see women more as individuals and not merely as as breeding breeding vessels, or one-dimensional figures who only like this, or figures who can be disposed of when you get tired of them after a while.
Yeah, I think that also goes back to the subversion that, like, oftentimes the female victim's story is a cautionary tale, right? Don't do this or this will happen to you. So that was obviously something that we were trying to avoid. And I think what it ended up turning into, yes, we were trying to get audiences to see the lady in red's humanity. And I think more than anything, we also wanted to, throughout the entire show, we wanted to acknowledge that women, sometimes the flaw of feminism, or I think what people see on the outside, right, is that we're lifting up women and empowering women, which is not inherently bad, but sometimes opponents think that we're showing women as like perfect beings that are not flawed. I think the story of the lady in red is a story of a woman who, her circumstances produced this flawed human being, right? We don't, at least for the real historical figure, if there was one, we don't know her origin, right? We don't know if she came from a good family. We don't know if she was, maybe like an illegitimate child. We don't know. But what we do know is, the work that she did, and the relationships that she had with her clients, the location where she ended up, she was just very much a product of her circumstances.
Right.
And that's what we wanted to present, is that just like, look at this human being, be vulnerable, be honest about the fact that the thing that she loved to do, or her job, led to her eventual demise. And that's something that's told throughout the other characters as well. At no point do we present, especially with like La Llorona, that, she is so demonized, right, for killing her own children. But we see like what circumstances led her to get to this point. And not that she's right? Not that she made the right decision, but like, what does a human being do when put between a rock and a hard place, right? What do they choose? And I think that is reflected in the story of the lady in red as well, that sometimes when life puts you in the situation where you have to do sex work for a living, you choose the best circumstance. It might be to love your clients and to do your work with passion and become the best in the business, to say, even if it eventually leads to your death.
Right. So sort of like, trying to present the situation in a way that you can understand where they're coming from, but you don't have to condone it. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to come on and discuss Lady in Red. I would like to do an episode where we take a look at the Bell Witch. I know that's going to be a bit more involved because there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah.
But if people want to follow you, or if they want to check out your work, where can they go?
They can go to @Mish Medina on Instagram, is where I usually post my stuff. It's MISHHMEDINA. Mythos has an upcoming performance at a Fringe festival. I can't say that much yet, but I'll be posting a lot of content as we start to prep for that show there.
Yeah, and if you give me the link, I'll put it in the description below, and I'll share it with everybody because it's really exciting just to see, how you're taking these figures from folklore and kind of presenting them in the slide, because again, it's so easy to demonize these figures because if you think about it, we only know about them at the surface level. Whereas what you're doing here is you're trying to get past the surface level, shallow understanding of who these individuals are and kind of giving us a bit more in depth, right? Just saying, well, you thought you knew this person here. Let me give you more details so you can actually make an informed decision on that. But I would really love to do an episode where we talk about the Bell Witch, and that's something we can definitely do at later on down the road. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch this episode. If you're enjoying the content, remember to hit the like button and subscribe, and check out Michelle on Instagram. The description, her link will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another episode of Myth, Magic, and Movies, the show where we take a look at all things gothic, horror, true crime, and supernatural and fantasy related, and we try to make sense of what's going on here. So if you've been following us for the past few months, I've been chatting with Michelle Medina Villalon, where we've been talking about figures from American folklore that she's put in her play Mythos, which premieres sometime around the spring. I don't want to say too much right now because I know that's something that you're kind of keeping, pretty tight-lipped about. But we've explored a lot of different characters in these episodes. We've looked at Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans, and we looked at the Lady in Red, who, even though we don't really know who she is, we know the kind of person that she is. And we briefly touched on La Llorona, and even with someone like La Llorona, we kind of know who she is and where she comes from. But there's one character in the play that kind of intrigues me, and this has been a character I've been fascinated with for quite a while, and it's the Bell Witch. And the Bell Witch features a lot in your play as well, because Michelle, you're taking these four figures from American folklore and kind of, would you say, kind of humanizing them or giving them a backstory? What's the best way to phrase that?
Yeah, I think both of those, humanizing them, kind of exploring, the women that could have been behind these societies. Yeah, I think that these four myths, at least in the show, are very representative of their time period and place. So we're kind of just bringing those sentiments and feelings and ideas to life.
And that's the thing too, because with the previous three figures that we've discussed, in a way, we know who they are and we can sort of sympathize with them, right? La Llorona, even though she did what she did, where she murdered her children, we can still, understand where she's coming from, even if we don't agree or sympathize with her actions, right? I mean, when you're caught in that situation where you feel like there's no way out, we've all been there. We can sort of relate to that. Marie Laveau, when we did our discussion of her, I was really trying to figure out why exactly she's vilified, because for the most part, she was just, a woman just trying to survive in New Orleans, and she actually did a lot of good in the city too. And even the Lady in Red, even though we don't know who she is, the fact that she was, a prostitute who, met an unfortunate end, there's something very tragic and sympathetic about it, because especially in that time period in the 19th century, women really didn't have that many options, so to kind of get forced into that situation, it's like, well, yeah, we can condemn it as much as we want, but there really isn't much we can kind of degrade them for, because they were forced into this position. They didn't have the many opportunities that women today enjoy. So with these three characters, we can we can understand and understand where they're coming from and sort of relate to who they are as people. The Bell Witch is kind of different because I was doing my research over the past week, and I gotta say, Michelle, there are two things that crop up. First off is we don't really know what the Bell Witch looks like, right? Because she's most famous for being this voice, and even then, when she does make her appearances, it's very, very off-putting. I mean, the most famous example that I can think of is the black dog with the rabbit's head. Uh, so, and when people, when people feel a presence, they say they feel a presence, but they don't actually see it. How exactly do you go about giving form to a figure that is infamous for not having one?
Mhm. There was a real opportunity, I felt like, when I started talking to my costume designer, and the actor playing the Bell Witch, that kind of came up, that similar question that, how do we portray a figure that nobody knows what they look like? Do we go, and I don't think this was ever something we were considering, but being hyper realistic and pulling out some of those animal elements. And the opportunity that we found is that because the show focused so much on the female perspective and what are experiences that women go through, that maybe we don't talk about as much. And one of those that came up was the feeling of being invisible, right? Feeling that you are in a room, especially during that time period, and that you are felt, but you are not seen, or at least not seen beyond for just like your physical presence there. So one of the things that we really focused on, and I worked with my lighting designer to do this, we kind of broke with tradition and theatrical tradition. And I remember when we lit that particular section of the play, we kept it really dark, first of all. And I know that we got some criticism from, we were in college at the time, so professors, and was somebody who came from the Kennedy Center to give us feedback. They were like, well, we couldn't see her face. And the explanation that I gave is that was very intentional. I mean, the whole point of the show was to be very environmental and kind of, immerse you rather than present something to you. But in that particular sequence of the Bell Witch, we wanted you to hear her voice. We wanted you to, like really listen to the words that she was saying, but maybe, like maintain that kind of elusive element. With her, we played a lot with sound. At one point we took her off stage and we just had her voice like echo over us. And when it came to actually costuming that character, we took a lot of inspiration from the way that art portrayed spirits during the 1800s. So we looked at fabric that was very, shimmery, very like impressionist almost kind of lines and design. And then for the actress's particular makeup, because the Bell Witch at points referred to being a Native American spirit that had been disturbed, we also pulled symbols, and she drew them over her face as well. We were a little limited in budget. I think if I were to produce that show again, and we will, but I still need to figure that out. I would actually like to draw a little bit more on those animal elements, because there are the only things that we know about her are those physical appearances.
But would you say that the lack of form kind of gives you the freedom to portray her any way that you want? Because really, because as we alluded to, the only documented forms of the Bell Witch are when she's in animal form. But there's also that I think it's like an engraving where William Porter is actually trying to throw her into the fire, and she's like wrapped up in a blanket or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like it was both challenging and liberating at the same time to kind of figure out how you wanted to portray the Bell Witch, while at the same time kind of staying true to the legend of who and what she is?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like I said, we really saw it as more of an opportunity. I think I spoke last time in the episode of The Lady in Red that, there were characters that we took creative liberty with. There were all four of them we took creative liberty with. And Lady in Red and Bell Witch really gave us the most opportunity because they weren't as defined. And Bell Witch more so because of that lack of physical appearance, right? With her, we really built out a narrative that I don't think anybody had ever alluded to, or maybe had come to the conclusion about the Bell Witch. And so in order to, I guess, really sell that world and that story to our audience, we needed to kind of make her fit some of our perceptions, some of our intentions for her character. I drew a lot of inspiration from movie. It's Middle Eastern. I don't forget which country, but it's called A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, where this main character is just like we would call her in rehearsals like the very like weird girl that you see a lot in film, right? I think the first one that always comes to mind to me is Allison in The Breakfast Club.
Mhm.
And so we really wanted to lean into that. And when it came to giving her like that physical appearance, yeah, just leaning into that like dark goth, like, you know, like the smudgy stuff around the eyes, like weird girl, you know, physical appearance.
Yeah, kind of like what you would see in like The Ring or other movies like that.
Yes.
So, another thing that I wanted to ask you too. So in terms of appearance, it's one of those things where it's kind of left up to your interpretation because there really is no exact form. So what we know about the Bell Witch is that she's famous for speaking, right? And you alluded to this already, the fact that you are focusing so much on her voice because her voice is pretty much her presence, right? She doesn't have she doesn't have the same luxury as Maria Laveau, for instance, who is famous for for being the voodoo queen, or La Llorona, where depending on the culture in Latin America, she's wearing either white or blue. How exactly did you create the voice, or what kind of technique did you and the actors kind of develop in order to create a distinctive voice for this character?
Mhm. So I think it began in the writing process, really. I'm sure that I mentioned this before, but Mythos, the play, originated as a series of 40-ish poems about just like separate female experiences, and then they all got compiled and assigned to each character that we decided to explore.
Yeah.
So when I was writing The Bell Witch from the beginning, I really wanted to lean into stuff that was strange. I wanted to lean into what we call in theater the grotesque, like stuff that makes us kind of unsettled.
Yeah.
And it wasn't so much because I like just wanted to weird the audience out, but because the voice of the Bell Witch, I mean, a paranormal spirit, like it's supposed to leave you feeling uneasy. And the experience that the Bell family had with her was that they were always on guard, that, it talks about how, the Bell Witch would like pinch the children and poke them with needles. And, like it was just always that feeling of having to walk on glass. And I really, in creating an immersive piece, I really wanted the audience to feel that. I wanted the Bell Witch to say things that didn't feel good to you, things that like made you think twice. And part of that was, we have her in the play. She sings a drinking song whenever John Bell is murdered, killed, or dies, depending on how you want to look at it.
Yeah.
And in that drinking song, she said, like, we really wanted, or at least I, as a playwright, really wanted to, like, contrast that, the mourning and the grief that you feel in that moment, like at a funeral that's supposed to be very formal and very intimate. And I wanted to be transgressive and say, what's more transgressive than to sing a drinking song at a funeral, right? So that was kind of the foundation for it. And whenever I handed off, those words to the actor that originated the role of the Bell Witch, she just, she ran with it. And I think another really important element beyond the voice in her performance was the movement. I really encouraged them to look at, again, like movement that was grotesque, like the horror theater of Anton and our Toad. We just we wanted to creep people out. And I think that actor also really saw it as an opportunity, that they would do things with their voice. I remember one of the things that I gave them was, if you've seen Jordan Peele's Us, Lupita Nyong'o, like the voice that like the alternate self has, that is like super gravelly, and like it when you hear her voice in that movie, it just makes you like, ugh, like it gives you goosebumps. And that was something that I had told that actor to look for, or look to for inspiration. We just really wanted to lean into the horror movie feeling, I think, with that character, and that the writing and some of those vocal techniques, the movement was really important to communicating that.
Well, yeah, because the Bell Witch kind of like goes from being like the stern authority figure, because we hear stories of, of the Bell Witch telling Betsy Bell, for instance, hey, when you go around this bend, you're going to want to hang on, otherwise you're going to fall out. To, as you said, being very transgressive and very irreverent when she's singing that drinking song at John's funeral, to kind of being a bit of a wise ass, especially when Andrew Jackson, stops by the house and she's like, oh, you better be careful, General, because one of your men isn't who he says he is. So it's kind of, so I would say, like, out of all the characters that you've written, I think the Bell Witch has, has a lot going for her, right? Did you account for all these different aspects of the Bell Witch as you were writing and directing what the actors had to do?
Yeah, I mean, it really, whenever it came down to choosing the Bell Witch as one of our 4 myths, that was one of the driving factors. I mean, part of it was that I love Southern Appalachia, and I think that Southern Appalachia is like a naturally creepy place. But the other is that I mean, especially for that time period, right? We expected women to act a certain way. We expected them to behave a certain way. And then you get this supposedly, right? Even though, there was no need to assign like a sex or a gender to this spirit, but they made her a woman. And I think that is just so interesting, speaks to the culture of that time, that she is doing all these things that are traditionally unladylike. And so, yeah, it was a real opportunity to just like put a woman, or tell the story of a woman who like truly does not give a heck what men think of her, what they perceive her as. And I really wanted to, whenever we were directing this particular actor, I kept pushing her to really, like, I was saying, like, jump off the deep end, don't be afraid, because I think even in modern society, right, we in theater, even though we're starting to break those rules now, there's still, a female stereotype for characters, right? We have different stereotypes. And I really just wanted to put a female character on stage who, before being a woman, she was just a human being. And so every time that she experiences something like, for example, the stuff that happened to Kate Batts, right? The people that they had coming into the home to try to drive out the spirit, we treated these all as transgressions to her. And what do you do whenever somebody confronts you, is fighting against you, is wounding you in that way? Historically, the way that we portray women doing that is that they are meek and they're submissive and they quiet down. And whenever you meet with resistance, it's something that's not it's unusual. So in the show, we really wanted to just respond to those basic human emotions, something that like I think is perceived as feminist, but it really should just be humanist, right? That like when we were telling that story, I remember specifically directing that actor, like, how would you respond, just as a person, how would you respond to having your home invaded, right? Like, if truly she was a spirit that was just disturbed, what did it feel like to have somebody take your home away from you? So that was at least one of the things that we focused on.
Yeah, and that's what I find so interesting, is the fact that when you're developing a character, right, even if it's a character based on legend, obviously you want to stay true to the legend because it's something that everyone's familiar with, but at the same time, you definitely want to put your own stamp on it, because obviously if you're writing and you're directing it, you want you want your aesthetic to kind of come through in all of this. But another thing that I kind of had to take issue with, because like I mentioned before with the other characters, Marie Laveau, the lady in red, La Llorona, they can be presented in a sympathetic light, right? Whereas here, I don't really know how exactly you go about making the Bell Witch sympathetic, because right off the bat, she's just going at it. She's like, she's attacking John Bell whenever she can. She's hitting up poor Betsy Bell. Like, there's one incident where she just basically tells Betsy, hey, that guy that you really like, you shouldn't marry him at all, right? So there's a part of me that kind of wonders, how exactly do you take someone who, at least from my perspective, is the instigator in a lot of these incidents, and how do you kind of present her you know, in a favorable light in the same way that you present, you know, the other characters in your play.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is also one of those circumstances where I had to remember, you know, I think it personally for me, the most compelling narratives in horror are those that don't present like a very clear good and a very clear evil, right? I think with all of these characters, La Llorona is a great example of it. The best that we can do is understand them and not excuse what they do. And so the Bell Witch is one of those, obviously, because all she does is terrorize this family who, you know, according to legend, didn't necessarily do anything bad to her. And so that's where that creative liberty comes in. One of the things that I just like, as I was doing my research, I kept noticing this obsession that she had with Betsy Bell. And I was like, wouldn't it be so interesting if she is doing all of these things because she loves Betsy? She's in love with Betsy. And so then I saw like an opportunity to tell the story of like, you know, sexuality as well. Like, you know, like if, you know, or like queer, like female stories. That was an aspect for it as well. I recognize that that is creative liberty because I know that that's not part of the legend. But I just saw like, I was like, this is a really cool storytelling opportunity, right? Like you said, you know, the Bell Witch at her worst was whenever Betsy became engaged to Joshua. Right. And so like, it just seemed like a really cool opportunity to be like, well, what if we tell this story and we kind of like show it in a different light?
Right.
So that was part of it as well. But I think that the other part of, you know, putting the Bell Witch in a more understanding, favorable light, as you said, is going back to that, like at its core, right? To me, that story seemed like this family came into her home. This family disturbed her. And whenever she began to resist, fight back, right? They're like, oh, well, this is our space. Right. But this is, you know, like if she was whatever, like if their house was built on the Native American burial ground, whatever it was, if she was a spirit of like light and evil, whatever, that was her home. And a family comes in, and whenever she responds, they begin to attack her back. And all of a sudden she's the villain, you know?
Yeah.
And so that was something that, I don't know, really compelled me, drew me to that character. I didn't want to, because there's so much question around the origin of her, I didn't necessarily want to make a very clear parallel of, you know, imperialism and colonialism. I think we do that later with La Llorona. But that was part of it as well. I think that you do see kind of the repetition of this theme in the Bell Witch's tale, that she is attacked, and all that she does is respond. You know what I mean? We could see it as like, oh, she's terrorizing this family for no particular reason. But again, there had to be some kind of break there, some kind of transgression there whenever they came into her home, into her space. And we also saw an opportunity, for example, with Kate Batts, who is allegedly, you know, connected to the Bell Witch. And once it's proved that she's not, Kate Batts is still, you know, pushed away from society. She's still humiliated. She still loses her dignity because there's a literal witch hunt that happens around her. And I think that that is a perfect metaphor for the same thing, or example for the same thing that could have happened to the Bell Witch, and a theme that we see later, you know, in this or before in the Salem witch trials, just this theme of, you know, women being attacked, and then whenever they respond or they fight back in a human way, they're vilified. And so that's more so the story that we wanted to tell as well.
Yeah, because based on the description that you're presenting here, she's not so much as the instigator as she is a reactionary, right? Whereas, you know, most people, when they look at the Bell Witch story, they say, oh, well, clearly she's the one who started all of this, and John Bell is doing his best to fight back because, you know, she's causing all these problems for him and his family and his slaves, right? So you did mention Kate Batts, and actually that's a pretty good transition. So another question I wanted to ask is, how much does Kate Batts, you know, factor into your play? Because for the longest time, you know, there's this misconception that Kate Batts was identified as the Bell Witch when she was just, you know, an innocent bystander who kind of got looped into this whole mess, and just based on circumstantial evidence that she had a beef with John Bell back in North Carolina. She happened to live pretty close to him in Adams, Tennessee. She kind of gets, you know, unfairly targeted. But but at the same time, we also can't ignore the fact that she did factor pretty big in the narrative. How big of a character was she in your play?
Yeah, Kate Batts, I think, like I mentioned just now, we focused more, I guess, on, representation in the sense of like, the same thing that happens to Kate Batts is what happens to the Bell Witch. But we really treated her as a bystander because at least in the research that I did, it just felt like this woman was pulled out virtually out of nowhere, and she was just used as a scapegoat to excuse the stuff that these people were doing to try to find the Bell Witch. And at the end, she's humiliated, she's attacked. So really, she gets a very brief mention. I know that historically that might be a little unsatisfying, but to me, I felt like this was just so much more. This story is so much more about the Bell Witch, this particular vitriol she has for John, against, it seems, almost like patriarchal figures in general. And I think that Kate, in my interpretation, was just somebody who got caught in the crosshairs.
Yeah, just because her name just crops up at one point, they're like, it's her, and they just start running after her for some reason. But to be fair, like, she really doesn't do herself any favors too, because she does have that reputation that already kind of makes her an outlier in society,
Yeah, but I mean, but that also, like, it goes back to our like what we expected women to do. I mean, not even in that time, but now that, like, she was an outsider, but she's also just a woman minding her business. And then, like, just because she has, beef with John, that, like, she's immediately, like, pulled into this. And, when she responds in whatever way that she does, like, she just gets herself more attacks. I don't know. I think it's very telling. I mentioned this before, that I think society at that time really told on itself by having a figure in the urban mythology like Bell Witch. I think that she's very and Kate Bass's association with her, I think, is very representative, right, of what we expect women to do. Like, how dare you not speak to other people? How dare you be an introvert and an outsider to society? Society is your status as a woman during that time.
Yeah, and we are talking about the antebellum South too. So this is a society that's very much structured and hierarchical, right? I mean, someone like John Bell, he's the head of the family, he's the head of the household, and what he says goes. So so when you have someone like the Bell Witch come in there, kind of turn things on its head, it's bound to make get everybody's attention, because of the fact that this is not only a spirit but a female spirit who's decided, I'm going to go ahead and just buck the trend, because I'm not having any of that, based on what you're presenting in the play. But I do want to shift gears a little bit, and I actually do want to talk about the Bell Witch herself, because she is a very interesting figure. And like I said, I've done some research over the past week. You've done a copious amounts of research on your end in order to write this character. So I want to go ahead and dive in. So what we know about the Bell Witch, as we've already established, she was this disembodied spirit who haunted the Bell family from 1817 to 1821. And the average layman, when they see or they hear the story of the Bell Witch, they're just going to say, "Oh, she's just an instigator who's going around tormenting this poor family for no reason," right? But as you described in your play, she's very much. She's not so much, an instigator, as she is reacting to a system that is pretty much trampling, all over her homestead, because we are talking about a period where America is starting to push westward, right? Tennessee is, slowly being developed, and it'll eventually become, another state in the Union. But what I also find interesting about the Bell Witch, and maybe you can talk about this in greater detail, is the fact that even though she torments John and Betsy Bell, right, whatever her reasons are, or her own reasons, she is equally kind to to John's wife, and she's also very. I mean, what's the right word to say? Like, a fascination or sort of friendly rivalry with the son, John Bell Jr. Because when I'm watching these videos, or when I'm reading up about the interaction between John John Jr. and the witch, it's almost as if they kind of respect each other, right? Because she doesn't torment him as much as she does his sister, right? And what's also what I find fascinating too is the fact that even though John Sr. is the patriarch, it's like if he tries to put his foot down, like the witch just laughs at him. But when John Jr. kind of steps in, she's like, "Oh, okay, I know I won't mess with you, so see you later." And then Lucy Bell, it's almost this maternal. I guess I could say maternal. Like there's a sort of like affection that she has for Lucy, which I find a bit odd because you'd figured she'd be a bit more maternal to Betsy Bell, really. So can you talk about that kind of aspect of the Bell Witch where she's simultaneously cruel and yet kind to the same family?
Yeah, I think it's something that we see a lot in even like like ghost hunting shows, right? And like in horror, that spirits tend to pick up on the emotional state of people, right? And even in whenever we talk about like supernatural hauntings and stuff, a popular theme that we hear is that like, oh, even though you've moved into a house and there's a spirit associated with that, once that spirit has attached itself to your family, even if you move somewhere else, it will follow you, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also hear that spirits tend to show themselves more and more aggressively whenever they perceive that somebody is afraid of them. If you choose to believe in the supernatural and the paranormal, these are some of the themes that we see.
Right.
I think that at least whenever in our show, we really portray the relationship between Bell Witch and John to be kind of a power dynamic shift. I think it comes down to if the Bell Witch, if that spirit was particularly perturbed because the fact that somebody came to invade her home, it is only natural that she would be mad with the head of that household, right? Because he is the one that made a decision to take them there, take his family there. He's the one that is establishing that power there, and there's that kind of face off. I think with John Bell Jr., we can only speculate as far as to that relationship. I know that in our show, maybe if it does come down to power dynamics, John Bell Jr., he's maybe an heir, right? And, maybe having that respectful, more peaceful relationship between those two means that whenever it comes time for him to inherit that house, that land, he'll go elsewhere. Right? We don't want to terrorize him because what if he tries to do the same thing as his father? That was one of the questions that we asked. In our particular show, we already talked about the fact that we think that the Bell Witch had some kind of crush on Betsy. That's our speculation.
Yes.
That's our speculation. That is not written anywhere. But at least whenever we were exploring that character, one of the questions that came up was like, maybe that's why she likes her mom, because, maybe they look alike, right? Maybe they act similarly. Maybe, there's just something about the mother that reminds the Bell Witch of Betsy. I think that removed from, that theory or whatever, it could be also that if it's a power dynamic problem, that maybe the Bell Witch sees that in this culture, in this society, the wife has to be submissive to her husband, right? And so, John established his presence here. He himself trespassed onto my land, but his wife, you're just a casualty, right? You just followed him because that's what's expected of you. And I can sympathize, I can empathize with that. So, those are just theories. What we can do, I think, with this character, but I do think that that's where you see those family dynamics come into play. And when you see the patterns of the way that she haunted this family, I think that it seems that the spirit very much glued on to particular family members based off of that relationship and that perception. It wasn't just a one size fits all haunting. It was very custom. It was very tailored.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, because because when we look at the story, it seems like the only person who really was afraid of the witch was Betsy, right? Because John Sr., I think it was just more of like frustration about having to deal with this, and Lucy Bell, I think it was just more of, well, I'm just here. I mean, what else can I do? And then John Jr., he kind of like takes on a more assertive role. So based on what you said, it kind of makes sense that Betsy would kind of receive, I guess, the worst of it, right? When it comes to the Bell Witch. You also mentioned too that Appalachia is one of your favorite one of your favorite areas to study. I guess we can call it, excuse me, Appalachian Gothic. What is it about that particular part of the country that just makes you say, "Oh, I wonder what's going on here. I better look more into that."
Yeah. I wouldn't say that I was born and raised in Appalachia because I'm like a little, like shifted off to the Charlotte area, but
Yeah, you're a city girl.
yes, city girl. But I grew up visiting that area a lot, and visiting the kind of landmarks that we're used to down here, or at least like in the Blue Ridge Mountains, like Mystery Hill. And I think that like personally, just what draws me to Appalachia is that there's a feeling of like, we're scared of what we don't know. And I think Appalachia, especially in the early days of the United States, it was just like an area of vast wilderness that was unexplored. And even to this day, like, again, as a city girl, right? Like, I think sociologically, our perception of Appalachia is like, and this is not mine, but I think culturally, sometimes we say like, oh, well, those are the Hicks, right? Those are like the people that are not as progressive as we are, and they have a backwards mentality. And I think that kind of sentiment of shoving off to the side and alienating these people just based off location has also created this kind of fear. I mean, I think socially, but also just like we could talk about, fear culturally about what we don't know, about these people that we don't know.
Right.
I think a lot of the like really inappropriate and like not correct jokes sometimes that we make about about Appalachia, about like cousins marrying cousins, things like that. It comes down to the fact that we don't know what happens out there, right? There's a culture, there's a society there that we don't necessarily understand, and I think that has created a lot of potential for the kind of urban myths that come out, or even just like legends, tall tales that come out of Appalachia. I think a lot about that I have friends that grew up there, and I'll like be walking with them, for example, and I'll just like start whistling casually, and immediately they're like, no, you need to stop doing that. Like there's because of the idea that calls spirits to whistle or to sing at night. There's just like these little myths and tales, because you have a part of the country that is removed, that for a long time people didn't explore, and you get these like just little creepy like legends and myths that come out of there. And I think there's just kind of like, I guess, a mystical perception of that area that really draws me to the stories that come out of that place. I think, cities have their own thing, but there's only so much that you can pull out of, subways and skyscrapers and things like that. Being out there in nature, out in the wilderness, in parts that are unexplored and whenever things happen that you can't explain, I think that there's just something magnetic about those type of stories.
Well, not to mention too, because living in in a city like Charlotte, for instance, it's very much developed, right?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of reminds me of an episode of The Simpsons where Bart and Milhouse they go to debunk every myth about Springfield Elementary, and when they debunk the last myth, they're like, "So school is just a building where kids go to learn?" And like, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's how I feel about Charlotte, is because we've developed, every inch of land, down to the root. There really is nothing mystical about it. Whereas Appalachia, right? It's a different place. It's untamed. It's very mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you, do you remember the manhunt for Eric Rudolph from way back in the day, like late '90s, early 2000s?
No, I was toddler age during that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh God, I'm giving away my age now.
But I would love to hear about it.
But okay, so in a nutshell, Eric Rudolph was, I guess you could call him like a domestic terrorist, because when I was in school, like I think like fifth grade in like the late '90s and early 2000s, he committed several acts of domestic terrorism, and he fled into the mountains of North Carolina, right? And what was fascinating was the fact that he wasn't caught immediately. It took I mean, you had like squads of police and FBI scouring that part of North Carolina for months and even years looking for this guy. And I would even recommend you check out. There's an episode of the 90s. It's a documentary from CNN that explores different aspects of the decade. And there was an episode where they were interviewing an officer who's taking part in the manhunt for Eric Rudolph, and he was talking about there were caves that are really, really, really deep. You don't know where they go, and they're like snakes as thick as your arm, and they're like spiders as big as your hand, and stuff like that. And it just made me think, like, how wild of a place could Appalachia be, that a man who commits these acts of terrorism can just go out there and hide for years and years and never get caught. Now, eventually he did get caught because he was just rummaging for food, and an officer just arrested him for rummage, for I guess picking through the garbage, and then they found out who he was, and then he got booked as a result. But the reason why I bring that up is because when you were talking about Appalachia, it's a place that's just so foreign to us. Not only is it because it's in a different part of the state that most people really wouldn't frequent that much, but the fact that it looks foreign, right? It's untamed. It's not a place that hasn't been developed to the hilt like you see like in other parts of the state, right? Have you ever felt like that the landscape itself is intimidating, and you could sort of understand and see where the rise of folklore comes from in that area?
For sure. One thing that I was thinking about whenever you were talking, and you'll have to fact check me on this, but I think that Linville Cavern, there's a popular like meme, I guess, that goes around the internet that like shows that I think it's the Sierra Nevada, and the Appalachian Mountains, and the Appalachian Mountains just look so puny, and like the West Coast was making fun of them, and somebody was like, well, that mountain range has existed like when there were still dinosaurs around. Like it is a crazy old like part of geography of the United States, but I think it's Linville Caverns that like there were no fossils found in it because like it was prior to there like being animals in that part of the world. So like whenever they were excavating it, they didn't find those things. I might be wrong, but I feel like I remember that. But like if you just go and visit that part of the state of this region of the country, like like there's so much potential for there to be stories like spiders the size of your hand, because like it's unexplored, it is ancient, and so of course it's going to be a little creepy. So I think that like just the actual geography and natural landscape of that area lends itself very naturally to that. And we see that in other parts of the state, right? Like where's Bigfoot located? Right? You don't necessarily hear of cryptids not even Mothman, because he's in like the deep parts of West Virginia.
Like West Virginia, Ohio, that area.
Yeah. And so like we assign like I think these very mystical roles to the parts of the country that are still underdeveloped, because it's again hard to have like Bigfoot in Charlotte.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, because to go back to the Bell Witch, when you tie her to Appalachia, it kind of makes sense, right? Because because we're talking about an area of the country that even in the early 19th century hasn't been fully touched or explored by people from the East Coast, right? So to your point, when you have someone who is very irreverent, very transgressive, it kind of makes sense because she's the spirit of the land. She represents exactly what the land is. It's untamed, right? Now, another thing that I found interesting too, and please feel free to chime in and add your own thoughts on this. She's very omnipotent. That's what you come to learn about her, is the fact that she knows all these things, because I think there was one story where there was an English visitor. He stopped by and visited the Bell home, and he challenged the witch, and he said, well, what's my family saying in England? And she actually tells him, yeah, this is what your family is saying right now in England. And then there's and another story that comes to mind is when John Jr. Has to go away on a trip, and the witch tells him, if you go on this trip, it's not going to end too well for you, because it was a business transaction he was trying to do. And the witch even added, hey, if you don't go on your trip and you stay in town, you'll meet this lovely woman from Virginia, and there's a huge chance that you two might get married. Obviously, John doesn't put too much credence into it. He goes away for a month, and the business deal falls through, and then the lady ends up not marrying him because he wasn't there to sweep her off her feet. So when it comes to the Bell Witch, as much as we want to malign her, and just say she's either an instigator or reacting to what's going on here, there's also no denying the fact that there's a lot more to her than what we simply want to assign her, right? Did you have there been any particular episodes or stories from or from the legend that you kind of took to heart as you were writing this character, and maybe kind of like see if the actor is familiar and try to incorporate those elements into their portrayal of the witch?
Yeah, I think largely the word omnipotent is a really good, I think, descriptor for the Bell Witch. Largely a theme that we try to pull out of her is that she's sort of a visionary and sort of timeless, in that same way that, because she had almost some of these like oracle-like abilities in that time. In our story, we're like, wouldn't it be interesting if she begins to touch on subjects and like topics of things that, or female experiences that people are dealing with now, right? And in her the last section of the Bell Witch's chapter, I guess you could say, in the play, she begins to make references to modern times, right? Things that are happening today. One of the things that we mention is like the insurrection, like gently, like we talk about it lightly in that final poem. So that was something that I really wanted to capture, because in writing this entire play, I really didn't want to get caught up in going into particular like bits of history, or like I don't know how to explain it. Like, I guess I didn't want to lean into the hyper realism of these characters, because that is something that you can find, right? That is something that has been done before. That's why we know these characters, is because of their oral history. So I wanted to focus more on, I guess you could say, like, large idea, right? And that's how we get that bit about the Bell Witch, that I was like, well, I don't necessarily want to include Andrew Jackson in my play, but how do I
That's the best part, though.
I know, no, I understand. I think that it is I think that, how can I explain this? I'm
gonna be sitting in the front row with my arms crossed, just saying,
yeah, like, where's
Andrew Jackson here? I want to see Andrew Jackson take on the Bell Witch.
Well, and a part of I think creating this show was that, like, I know that at least whenever we brought it to the town that we performed it in, people hadn't heard of these characters before. And so some of them, La Llorona, like, everybody has heard about her, but we wanted to, instead of just being like, oh, here's like this little ghost story, we wanted to explore the bigger like topic, like the bigger ideas, make people think about things, and then lead people to go and do that research on their own, or like go and Google like Wikipedia Bell Witch, like tell me all the things, because like that's how I became inspired for these characters. Some of these characters like I had not heard of before, but these ideas, these like female experiences, whatever, that like I was trying to connect to them, made me want to dive more and learn more about their story. So I think with the Bell Witch, the way that we captured that omnipotence, right, was that elemental feeling of putting her voice everywhere, like those predictions. We did talk about because it made sense for our story that she told Betsy to not marry Joshua. We included that in there. But
what about the because there's another story where she actually takes exception to, I think his name is Dean or something, and she turns him into a donkey and she rides him all the way to his house. Did you?
I didn't hear about that one.
Okay, so apparently there was this guy named Dean, and he was famous for being the best axeman in Tennessee, and he carried a witch ball with him, right? Because he he knew that he would run into the witch, and the witch encounters him along the way and says, "Hey, give me your witch ball, or I'll turn you to a donkey." And this is, and by the way, this is like a really, really dumbed down, stripped down version of it. I encourage you to check out that story on your end if you have the time. But long and short of it is, Dean says, "No, I'm not giving you my witch ball because then you're going to hurt me." And she's like, "All right, I'm turning you into a donkey." And all of a sudden, he like finds himself on all fours, and he feels like this pressure on his back, and he's like basically like running all the way home. And he's like, "Okay, never mind. I think I will give you my witch ball. Never mind."
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I definitely need to look into that story.
He also, I think it was also the same guy where when he saw the black dog, the Bell Witch as the black dog, he decided, being full of piss and vinegar, he was going to take a swing at the Bell Witch, and he actually struck the black dog with his axe. So when he saw the dog again, it had two heads because he cleaved it in half, and it was doing the Hydra thing.
Yeah. And I think, with these ghost stories, and particularly with Bell Witch, that is more of like a haunting. Honestly, like, I think that is like, that's what draws me to these ghost stories, that there's just like, there's such how can you say, there's such a legend associated with it, that I think that once you begin to dig, you begin to find those things out, you begin to like unravel the thread. And I think in our play, I think what we were more concerned about was getting people to the point where they could find the thread to start unraveling it. So we touched lightly, I think, on those elements of her ghost story, and I mean, we were also limited to 60 minutes. So there's so much that you can do with maybe like the 15 minutes that she got of stage time to tell the very, like, I didn't even know that thing about the donkey. So there's definitely like a lore associated with her that's hard to capture. Oh, I lost your audio, I think.
Oh, so I was gonna say, like, if you do write another play about the Bell Witch, I mean, you can definitely include that story in there because it's very cool. So another thing I want to ask you too, because because when it comes to telling stories about historical figures, whether they're ghosts or political figures or whatever, sometimes there is an association with a production that doesn't go down too well. I know, the most famous one is the Scottish play, right? And the myth is, if you say the name of the play, bad things will happen. In modern times, the BBC did a production of I, Claudius, which was based on a book, and apparently, if you write a book or you do a play or a TV series about the Roman Emperor Claudius, bad things happen, right? So when it comes to telling the story about the Bell Witch, have there been any strange encounters, anything weird? Did you like find yourself encountering like strange happenings, like all of a sudden like the light in your living room just going off for no reason? Anything bizarre happening there?
It was something that we joked about whenever we started the production, that we were like, wouldn't it be funny if, and what the one, strangely enough, the person that we were actually concerned about was the person playing Marie Laveau, because in order to play Marie Laveau, she had to do some research about voodoo and hoodoo. And she was like, God, I don't want to accidentally conjure anything. But surprisingly, the person that had really the only interactions or like just strange occurrences was the person playing the Bell Witch. Immediately after we started, it was a devised production. So whenever we started devising sessions, they would go home to their apartment, and like the door to their closet would like open and shut randomly. And it wasn't like the draft. Dang. Yeah, the draft is like moving it. It was that like it would unclick and then click back. And usually it was doing it at night whenever she was sleeping. And one thing that we had happen also frequently in the production, and it was awful because it was a very short production time, is that we were rehearsing in a black box theater that was at the bottom of a hill. And this was like, I want to say like January, February, a time famously in North Carolina where it like snows, but it doesn't like that's really, or like ice falls, but that's really the weather that we get. We experienced flooding in that theater like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
Like at the bottom by the door, and like there was just like always an unusual amount of rain, and for some reason it always happened during our rehearsal time. Like there was never, it wouldn't, I don't know, it was weird. Maybe that was just the weather being bad with us, and it wasn't supernatural.
I mean, you were at the bottom of the hill.
We were at the bottom of the hill, so it was normal that it would flood. It was just strange that it was that time of year and that it would only happen during our rehearsal time. And sometimes it felt like the moment that we walked out is whenever it stopped. But I think the biggest thing was that in that theater, an older theater, but one that I had not experienced this problem with after 4 years of being at that university and, doing shows there. The light grid was always very reliable, right? Sometimes you go to a theater and there's like a light that's always flashing. That's a little weird. We had a light during rehearsal whenever we had work lights on that all of a sudden started flickering. And I had not ever experienced that problem before. We were like, oh, well, maybe it's just funky. And then during Q to Q, another light, only during the Bell Witch, like it was a green LED, would flicker during her.
And it was always the same light, right?
It was always the same light. And it was, even whenever we experienced the work light flickering, it was in the same location of the theater. And so it was like, gosh, like this like corner of the theater is not lit well. But that was the interesting thing, is that I assumed that it had to do with I forget what they had to rewire something for a special that we had for La Llorona. And so I was like, oh, whenever like La Llorona's like piece starts, when the light switched to blue, that corner will still flicker. And no, like it was the same light. It was blue. It would not flicker.
Right. It would stay on.
It was, yeah.
Okay.
And so I don't know what it was about that particular light. It was only during the Bell Witch's monologue. We only knew because those LEDs were like, they would switch colors. And so we knew that whenever we were transitioning from green, which was the Bell Witch color, to blue, La Llorona, we all of a sudden were like, oh, like they were fine for this part of the show, but then the rest, like during the part before, it's not working. So we never managed to figure out what that was about.
But it wasn't like that bulb was like all of a sudden decided not to work. I mean, I'm assuming you were using the same bulb and worked pretty well, because I mean, I'm not an electrician, but I'm assuming like if you use a bulb for like a play, it's going to stay working for however long it takes, right? Did it confound the lighting people at all, or did they just say, oh yeah, it's just the witch doing her thing,
Yeah, we just kind of went with it. One of the things that we were I think the creepiest thing that happened was that during our, like, that was already kind of something that we were like believing. We were like, oh, maybe we are getting a little haunted.
Yeah.
Whenever we were blocking, the actor, again playing the Bell Witch, would occasionally find like bruises on parts of her body, like without explanation, and we were like, well, maybe you're anemic. But she was like, no, this is like the first time that things like that have happened to me. So at that point, yeah. So she would get like bruises like up and down here.
And she's not, and when you're blocking, obviously you don't have the set furnished yet.
No, and I mean it's a very movement heavy show, but like they weren't like it would have been bruising on her knees, on her shins would have been normal, but finding them on forearms was unusual. So by the time that we were putting on the show, like we were like, oh, it's just Belle. That light that's not working, it's just Belle. If we have like a bad thing happen during the show, it's just Belle.
Well, now you've piqued my curiosity here, Michelle. Did the bruises go away like once production ended? Like,
I think that after, it was something that appeared during blocking and working. During performances, she wasn't getting bruises, so I don't know what that was about. Okay. Because she's still performing, the actor was still performing the same show, doing the same things. But really, once the show started, I don't remember her mentioning the bruises anymore, if she was still getting them.
So when did all this occur exactly? Like, was it occurring like during the fall or the winter or what?
It was the rehearsal process for the show was November through February. The interesting thing is that we then took the show to tour. We toured it to Kentucky, and we didn't have anything strange happen during the touring production. It was a very quick turnaround. It was like 1 week of rehearsal and then like the performance that weekend.
Yeah.
But I don't remember anything unusual. And we were all like kind of getting ready for it because on our drive to Kentucky, we did cross through Adams, and it was a shame that we couldn't stop by to.
Oh, I was gonna ask you guys
I really
stopped.
too. We were like trying to convince our driver. We were like, please, and like, no, we're doing a 6-hour drive to Kentucky. I'm not stopping.
Yeah, we're on a schedule here.
Yeah, we're on a schedule. But yeah, it was weird. I think the hauntings that we experienced, if you want to call them that, were really during rehearsal and working, and performance. Other than the light, we didn't really see anything. And on the touring, we didn't see anything.
Now, in terms of the haunting, for lack of a better word, this only occurred during the Bell Witch section, right? Because with the others like Marie Laveau, the Lady in Red, and La Llorona, it was pretty much smooth sailing, I imagine.
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, we were worried about Marie just because I don't necessarily subscribe to the supernatural. Maybe not. I do
You might
believe
want to change that, Michelle.
I'm not gonna do that. Especially somebody who wrote this show. Maybe I should. But I do have like a strong, I guess, spiritual belief that like if you don't understand something, maybe don't mess with it. And that was one of the things I had advised this actor to do research about voodoo. But I was like, don't practice anything. And she was like, well, maybe. And I was like, don't practice anything. But yeah, we didn't experience any haunting with the other three, just Belle.
Well, I was going to say, because I'm assuming this is the first time you're actually telling someone outside of production about this. So, so I was going to say, like, because you said you're working to get this staged this year. I would say that that's a pretty good selling point, because if you think about it, it's kind of like when the Exorcist got released. A lot of people were just as interested in what was going on, during production as when the movie came out, right? I think that would be a great selling point for you, Michelle, if you just went out and said, oh, by the way, here are a bunch of these weird things that occurred when we did our first production of it. The actress got bruises, that light kept flickering, the doors were, opening and closing all by themselves. I think it's a great marketing ploy, really. And I think it kind of would work in your favor right there.
Yeah, honestly, it would be great. The one thing that I'm scared of is that we're going to be doing some of the rehearsals for this upcoming show in my apartment. So I really hope.
Don't do the Bell Witch. Don't do the Bell Witch.
Yeah, I really hope. Yes, it is a great marketing point, and I 100% would go see a show if somebody told me that like it made them experience hauntings. But also, like, I don't want to bring any spirits into my home.
Well, Michelle, if it makes you feel any better, I give you permission to use, this episode or clip this portion of the episode and use it in lieu of marketing, just so you don't have to actually go through and kind of repeat yourself. You have my permission on that one. I'll even send you the timestamps too when I do the editing. But really, all jokes aside, that does speak to the omnipotence of the Bell Witch, because over 100 years onward, I mean, she still has that effect on people, right? Some people, because I remember watching Ghost Adventures, and people would go into that cave, and I think the curator would say, if you take a rock from the cave, bad things are going to happen to you. Mm-hmm. And I remember that they showed like segments where people were like reading letters from from the curator and just saying, I took the rock and then my brother-in-law got a car accident. I got diagnosed with cancer, so I returned the rock. Please take the rock back, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So it kind of just goes to show that this is a figure, and I would even say this is a figure out of all of the 4 figures in your play that you really don't want to tread lightly with. Like, did you ever get that as you were writing and producing that play?
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that there was a weight with all 4 characters that I wanted to respect their stories, and I wanted to respect the culture and society that they came from. Mm-hmm. I think that's a big burden to carry as a playwright, and sometimes also why I wanted to stick more towards, I guess, how could you say, maybe like broad strokes rather than a lot of detail, just because there, I think it's, and with the Bell Witch too, because there's such a lore associated with her. There's so many stories that I didn't ever want to misrepresent or, you know, tell something that was like a half truth. So yeah, I think there's a pressure of from a playwright's perspective to tell a story that is true, but I think there's a difference also between like history book true and experience true.
Mhm.
I think with the Bell Witch, we definitely leaned more experience, that we wanted you to feel that the truth of that haunting, of that terror, I guess, that the Bell family felt. And sometimes something that you don't have to spell out so literally for people. If you capture, I think, the essence of it, that that'll bleed into your interpretation of the character.
Right, right, because everybody's going to walk away with their own idea of who she is. I was going to say because I know right now you're keeping things under wraps because you are working to get Mythos you know, produced for 2026. If you end up having any more of these spooky experiences like you did the first time around,
Mhm.
please let me know right away so we can do an episode chatting about that.
For sure, for sure.
Please, please. So, so I want to go ahead and start wrapping things up because I mean we could talk about the Bell Witch for hours and hours, but I feel like I feel like for at least for this conversation, we've pretty much covered what your goal was and how you're trying to portray the Bell Witch in a more sympathetic light.
Mhm.
You did mention that there are many stories surrounding the Bell Witch. Is there a particular story, or are there like a couple of stories that stand out to you that you feel I really enjoyed like this story of the Bell Witch because it's so cool? Because for me, it's the one about, you know, Dean the Axeman getting turned into a donkey and then being ridden home, where his wife finds the witch ball on the front porch. Is there any stories that kind of stood out to you as you were doing the research or as you were writing?
Yeah, I think, you know, as a playwright, I love the idea of her singing drinking songs at the funeral. I just thought that that was a compelling image. But I think as Michelle, one of the things that you touched on earlier during this conversation was that she was just kind of a smartass. And for me, I love that John was on like a hunch. He like wanted to know the origin of the spirit. And every time that he would bring people in to have a conversation with the spirit, to try to speak to her, to try to satiate her, she'd be like, well, actually, I'm this. Like I'm a spirit from a Native American burial ground. And then she shows up as a dog. And then she says that she's a spirit of both heaven and hell. And then she's like, oh no, I'm a happy spirit. I've just been disturbed. And so I think that this, like, I love the idea of this spirit just toying with these men, and they're like very seriously trying to uncover, you know, to like remove her from this house. And she's like, well, here's what I am, but no, I'm not, just kidding. That was something that I really enjoyed, especially whenever I was talking to the actor about it, and I was giving that as an example, inspiration for her to kind of play off of.
Mhm.
That yes, she was terrifying and, you know, a horrible spirit, but also, you know, she was playing these like very serious older men. um
Well, not horrible, misunderstood, just in case,
but
just in
yes,
case.
yes. But yeah, I think that's one of my favorite things about her.
I was gonna say too because I know we alluded to this briefly, but I really love the fact that Andrew Jackson took an interest in the Bell Witch, right? And I think he famously said, "I would rather face the British again rather than face the Bell Witch," right?
Mhm, mhm,
Because we were talking about the guy who was a war hero during the War of 1812, right? A man who was who was tough as nails and just, you know, he was a self-made man. He didn't take shit from anybody, right?
mhm.
And even a guy like that, Old Hickory, knew, yeah, I'm not going to f with the Bell Witch. Um,
Absolutely.
but Michelle, I know this is something that you're still working on. Mythos is still something that you're working on because, and I think you said that it's you're. Did you say you're like rewriting some bits of it or what?
I tentatively say, because I think that once I introduce this script to 4 new actors, we might learn that some things need to change, and maybe we'll include Andrew Jackson just for you. Um, but it is tentatively done, maybe.
Right.
Yeah, before its next production.
Gotcha. Um, One last thing. So, so whoever happens to play the Bell Witch, are you gonna mention the bruises that the last actress got, or are you gonna make it kind of deliberate that whoever the current actress is doesn't contact the previous actress?
Thankfully, well, this could be both beneficial. I see it as beneficial. The actress playing the Bell Witch in this iteration was La Llorona in the first production.
Oh
So
my god.
not only does she know, but I think she's kind of into it. I think that she thinks it's cool. So I'm gonna let her just do her thing.
Michelle, if you can, please put me in touch with the actress who played the Bell Witch initially. I want to talk to her. I want to get the full deets on that because, oh my god, I'm like, I have never, like, you can't see it, but I literally have goosebumps right now, like as you're telling that story, because I'm like, it's, it's pretty warm where I am. I'm not gonna lie, I'm wearing a t-shirt and everything, but when you mentioned when you mentioned the bruises and all that, I was like, oh man, like I'm starting to get a little bit freaked out here. You didn't no, you didn't experience anything personal, right? Like you didn't wake up one morning and see like blood dripping down your walls or anything,
No,
right?
no. This is something that I do for myself in practice, but maybe it worked to dispel any spirits, is that I have just kind of like a ritual for myself that every time that I come into a rehearsal, I
Mhm.
like say like a thing like I'm here, and then like, and this is what I want to happen, and when I leave I'm like, and this, and I'm leaving, and this is what I'm leaving behind. So maybe the spirit was nice enough to take that as a suggestion.
I just have this image of you, and I don't know how you take it, but it's not meant to be in a bad way. I had this image of you like walking with like a purse full of Palo Santo wood, like when you walk into the theater, you like light it up and you just start waving it around.
I know. Honestly think that the actor that played the Bell Witch did sage out her bedroom after like the closet experience that she had, and maybe that helped.
Well, Michelle, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to come on here. I know you mentioned that you were a little late because there was a bit of an incident on the highway, so thankfully you are safe. And I would encourage you to stay safe tomorrow, because tomorrow is going to be a very big day. And if you don't have to be out on the road, please don't be on the road, because people are going to be crazy as hell. But I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch our episode of The Bell Witch. It's a very interesting topic. This may not be the last time we talk about the Bell Witch, but other than that, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.